thank you for choosing to be here with us today, whether you're physically in the room or watching us elsewhere or watching later. I wonder, for those of you who are watching later, what I'm about to say won't make any sense. But for those of you who are watching now, did that song kind of twitch you a little bit? Because we have this, and this is actually quite amazing for the talk. We have this story about what America means. And it's the story we carry in our head and our hearts. And it necessarily hasn't been our experience lately, right? So we get to deal with that and figure out how to work that disconnect between what's going on in our exterior world and the world that lives inside our minds. And that's actually a description for everything that happens in our world, because we're all always working that disconnect between our internal reality and what we're seeing in the world in front of our eyes. I wish we had done it on purpose. It's really quite cool. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is this business of internal limitations versus external ones. Because we're all walking around in a world that seems to be wide and deep, full of external limitations, right? How many of them live inside your head and don't really exist? Or you make them worse by the story you tell in your head. Because remember, the only place we can actually make a change is that gray matter between our ears and below our hair. Because that's the place we have control. That's the place we have the ability to create a different reality that must show up in front of our eyes. And if we're carrying garbage thinking, we're going to have garbage experience. Yikes. So it's this tightrope almost that we walk all the time of, and I had forgotten that was Neil Diamond until you told me it was Neil Diamond, and then you were playing that. It's like, oh yeah, that's Neil Diamond. That's how he would do it. Because we've got this story in our head of how it ought to be. And that's part of the story we're working on balancing or creating or working with, to come to a place where we have a match between what's going on in our minds and in our insides, and projecting that out into the world of form and having it show up. So that's kind of the frame of the talk, and I could almost stop talking now because David did it for me, but I'm not. I'm going to keep going. So, from Joseph Campbell, don't think of what's being said, but of what's talking. Is it malice, ignorance, pride, love? And then the kicker, the goal of the hero's journey is to find ourselves. We have that job. And all of us are heroes in our own reality. I mean, that's just kind of how we're packaged. So that's not some special person up on a pedestal who's the hero. Every single one of us is that, and we have that job. And the only place we can work is, within our own skulls. And we are always free. In fact, I won't use the word mandated because that's a little strong, but it is our job to interpret what we're seeing and figure out what's behind that and what we can do to see a different reality. And that's the big deal, right? And that's what's in each of us all the time as our deliverable, to use an old word. So anyway, that's the packaging. So last week in Monday night's class, I used a free meditation from Insight Timer to open the class. And if you don't know about Insight Timer, give yourself the gift of exploring it. It's a tremendous resource that's available to anybody. And the one that we used was a meditation by a guy named David Harshada. And it was about experiencing life as it happens to us. And here's the kicker: without judging it, without making stories to make it worse, or without exaggerating the situation. What is really going on, and how does that experience happen in our lives? Because just like me, if I don't make a story about something, I'm probably not paying attention. And so our job is to become as truthful as we can, as accurate as we can in telling a true story, not some fantasy thing that disempowers us or disempowers the person we're looking at. That's the human bias. And that's our biggest challenge. That's why freedom from our internal limitations is such a big deal, because we're making them up. And we're the only ones that can change it. So, and when I turned on the meditation, I said, oh yeah, this is 20 minutes and we're staying for the whole thing. It's like, 20 minutes? Holy cow, that's a long time. And yet, it was exactly right, because it made us present. And it made us aware of what we were seeing, what we were experiencing, and that requirement to be accurate and to be present and to not make stuff up. So, from Tim Burkett, from a little thin book that I keep coming back to, so there's something there, called Zen in the Age of Anxiety. In meditation, we learn to observe the arising of a strong emotion, to feel its intensity and notice where in our body it is held, and to begin to see the reactive patterns that occur. We see how we magnify and generalize by making stories out of our feelings. We weave a web around that emotion and then get caught in it, often catching others as well. It's a simple message, right? It's simple but not easy. We entrap ourselves every single time we tell a story that we can't, or we shouldn't, or we're not allowed to, or it's too hard, or we don't deserve it, or so-and-so is against us. Once we realize we're creating a false mythology, because that's what it is, we can stop and we can change our minds about what we're experiencing and see it clearly. Because it is that storytelling that is our default practice that we have to be in charge of. And when we realize we've done it again and we're telling ourselves another bit of garbage thinking, we get to stop and say, hang on a minute, that's not what's true. And pull ourselves back to that recognition of what really is happening right now. So last week I talked about William Irvine's book, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, which still sounds like an oxymoron in my head, but whatever. And Irvine wrote that there's a trichotomy of control. There's 3 parts. 1, things over which you have complete control, things over which you have no control, and things over which you have some control. And what do we control absolutely? We control our own goals, our own values, and how we think about what happens in our lives. What don't we control? Whether it rains at my house or not, whether it rains at your house, whether the sun rises or not, whether it's going to be hot, cold, muggy, whatever. We don't really have a lot of control over that. But last week I talked a lot about things that we have some control over, including some things that were not obviously obvious, like gravity. I don't control gravity, but I do control how I interact with it. And I'm glad I don't have to make gravity work. And I'm also glad I know how to work with it so that I can do stuff. I started to tell you a story, but it gets in the way. So the quote that Maria read when she did our spiritual thought today from the New Thought Dictionary, which is a cute little pink book, in case you've never seen it. It's a little bitty, like 3 by 4 inch book. Mind is the law that binds the ignorant and frees the wise. Same law. How are you going to use it? The thought of limitation creates limitation. The thought of freedom creates freedom. Since limitation is a limited viewpoint of reality, the greater viewpoint automatically heals the limitation. When we can see the bigger picture, that limitation that we've made up disappears, it vanishes. It gets to scale. It gets to the place where it's not such a huge catastrophic thing. Thus, and this is what Maria pointed out earlier, thus we are apparently bound and actually set free by one and the same law. We just have to know how to play with the speed limit, because it's that kind of thing. You know, we can work it like it's supposed to be used, or we can try to violate it and it will kick back. And then, from the very first page of the Science of Mind text, second paragraph, to suppose that the creative power of the universe would create humanity in bondage and leave them bound would be to dishonor the creative power which we call God. Why is that? Why would the divine nature not want to create humans and make us behave a certain way? It kind of defeats the purpose, right? If we're supposed to be expressions of the divine, then we need to have freedom in order to have thought and have the ability to act and interact and react. Because if we're just a bunch of little robots, what fun is that? Might be easier. But there's not any creative expression and expansion and opportunity in that. It's just a mechanical bunch of automatons walking around, right? It's not any fun at all. And in the creation story, the Judeo-Christian creation story, the way that Holmes tells it, we're supposed to be expressions of the divine, and our job is to be creative. If we're just acting according to a set script, is there any creativity there? It's boring. Obviously, we're not boring, right? We don't do boring. And I went looking to see if other cultures have creation stories where the divine created humans to be a companion. I did find a few, not many. Mostly it was not that. Mostly the human was created to serve some function. But in the Japanese mythology, in the Shinto mythology, humans were there to be a companion for the divine. So it's not just a Judeo-Christian thing. It's actually bigger than that. So that pleases me, that our job is to be expressions and to explore and expand and become more. Back to the Science of Mind textbook, page 25, first page again, paragraph 3. The divine plan is one of freedom. Bondage is not God ordained. Freedom is the birthright of every living soul. The truth points to freedom under law. Thus, the inherent nature of humanity forever seeks to express itself in terms of freedom. We do well to listen to this inner voice, for it tells us of a life wonderful in its scope, and a love beyond our fondest dreams, of a freedom which the soul craves. So here we've got this framework of freedom, of choice, of opportunity, and the controller in our head is the one that tells us whether we can have it or not. So does that mean hard stuff doesn't happen? Oh no. hard stuff does happen. What do we make of that? What do we do with that? How do we use that? And do we actually require hard things to happen? It's a good question, right? And everybody's going to have an individual answer. For me, I have to go back to that hero's journey story. It is, if the hero doesn't have something to overcome, there's no reason to expand. There's no reason to grow. There's no reason to change. It's just the same old, same old, same old, same old boringness. But we run into difficulties which allow us to step up, which allow us to have a bigger experience. And if we start looking at these difficult things that happen and see them from the light of, this is somehow for my good. I don't know what it is right now, but somehow this is for my good. This is for my up-leveling of my own experience. And when we can see those negative things that happen in our lives as beneficial, that changes the way we look at them. It's not common practice, right? This bad thing happened, oh my God, life is horrible. But when you want to build strength, if you're going to the gym and you want to build muscles, you want to build strength, you have to work against resistance. That's what those machines do, right? If you want to build stamina, you have to become a more cardiovascular kind of person and do those things that stretch. We have to step into a larger life in order to have a larger experience. So I started reading this book this week about the ways that parents neglect their children emotionally. You don't want to know what my reading list looks like. It's kind of all over the place. But this one was about how children as adults learn to overcome that experience of emotional neglect. The title of the book is called Running on Empty. And it was pretty interesting to me because it never occurred to me that, if a parent gives a child what they need, but they don't give them attention, they don't pay attention to what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, then it is a form of neglect. Like, wow, yeah. And there are 12 primary ways that parents can emotionally neglect their children, which really boil down to 3 different lack of practices. One is being too rigid, too controlling, too demanding. One is being too lax. If there are no boundaries, that's not actually good. No, whatever you want, go ahead, that's fine. But I don't know what to do now, right? And then the third way is parents they're absent. For whatever reason, they're absent. So if a parent is too controlling, then the kid never learns their own boundaries. They never learn to find their edges, because they're always working within boundaries that are too tight. And if the parents are too lax, whatever goes is fine. Kids have no boundaries. And they don't have the experience of learning where what works for them or doesn't. And the same with absent parents. Without something to push against, the children never learn to calibrate themselves. And so they grow up and they don't understand how come the world doesn't give them everything they want. And then we see things like that happening in our world and running. What happened to that child that they didn't get the guidance they needed when they were small? It follows, right? So, what makes the difference between someone who will push against their boundaries push against their limitations, whether they're the too rigid parent or stories they've been told, or you couldn't possibly do that because you don't have, whatever story you want to make up. What makes a difference between the kids that will push against those limitations and ones that will just sort of, behave? I don't know. I really don't. I would love to. Part of it, I think, is whether that individual believes they have some control over their life, some control over what they can do, some control over what happens to them, which comes down to whether they believe they have autonomy or agency, or this magical word called freedom. Just something to think about, because all of us are adult children of parents who did the best they could, and we're all exploring what those edges are and what the gaps are that we will have individually because of the way we were brought up. It's just part of the package. So we get to look at that and think about, am I living the life I choose? Have I created a story in my mind that limits me? That's not actually true, but it's something I've always believed is true, and therefore it is, right? We get to change that, and we change that by changing our minds. So, we already have been given this gift of heaven now, of complete freedom, and the promise that everybody gets there when they're ready, when they decide to, no matter where any of us start from or how long it takes. Holmes wrote in the Declaration of Principles, "We believe that heaven is within us and that we experience it to the degree we become conscious of it." And, he wrote, "We believe the ultimate goal of life to be a complete freedom from all discord of every nature, and this goal is sure to be attained by all." Doesn't have a timeline on it. It takes however long it takes, because we have to play in the sandbox of our lived experience in order to decide when to accept freedom. So, when you, like me, find ourselves disrespecting ourselves or disbelieving ourselves, saying we can't or we shouldn't or we're not allowed to or we're not supposed to or whatever, and claiming a lesser ability or a lesser capability, we get to look at that. And that's really what our job is. Our job is to assess our point of view in the world and decide whether this is something we actually do want to try. I was watching David practice before we started this morning, and my fingers were going, "You could play the piano." And I'm going, "Been there, done that, right? You could play the piano." Badly. I may have to turn my piano on at home and see what it looks like when I get home later today. Because it's the story in our heads that get in the way of us having that full life experience. And some of you know this story before, that I've told before. It's about an old-time practitioner named Vitura Papke. She was Holmes's practitioner once his wife Hazel died. Vitura was a popular practitioner. She was powerful. People waited, weeks to see her. And she was powerful because she was clear. She did not get distracted by the stories. She didn't get distracted by the blah, blah, blah. So the story goes, when somebody was sitting there with her in a practitioner session and they started going on and on and on about all the stuff that was wrong in their life, Vitura let him talk, but she was mumbling. And the person finally went, "Why are you mumbling? You're not listening to me." And she said, "Oh, I'm listening." "Well, what are you doing? You're talking at the same time. What are you saying?" And Vitura smiled. I'm sure she smiled. And she said, "Not a word of truth in it. Not a word of truth in it. You're making up a garbage story. She didn't say that part. But not a word of truth in it, because we've got these stories in our head, and we live as though they're true. We make our own limitations, and we're the only ones that can let ourselves out. And that's our job, is deciding what's worth it to us. Don't expect me to play the piano, because I know already that that's not worth it for me. But I can play the piano for my own enjoyment. I can do that. I can see my way to enjoying that experience rather than living in the old story, which isn't worth repeating because there's not a word of truth in it. We get to remember our divine nature. We get to remember to own and claim our freedom. And it's not a one-time deal. I wish it was. It's a continuous, perpetual, never-ending practice. And I think, eventually, it probably gets easier. It probably becomes second nature, like for Ventura, to fall on the side of, there's not a word of truth in that story. What's really true? Because we have, every single one of us has that capacity, that opportunity, that ability. It's not wasted. It's within each one of us, and we get to let it out. So I want to close with a poem by a new poet to me. Her name is, I think, I never heard it spoken, so I'm reading it, Kellen Harkin. Listen to this poem. It's called Eccentric God. If you think the eccentric God who made the octopus is going to judge you for your sins, I'm afraid you've missed the mark. If you think this wild God that spins galaxies as a pastime cares to get fussy about your mistakes, or has ever made anything that wasn't born perfect and luminous, you might need to rethink that. If you can't yet admit how lovable and infinitely worthy the fullness of your human nature is, and if you think God wants you to do anything, if you think God wants to do anything but perpetually pour an abundance of love gifts on you, well, my dear, your soul might need to think about that. So we have this perpetual opportunity. We have this perpetual task of seeing life clearly, seeing our choices clearly, seeing what we desire to have become possible for us clearly. And as far as I know, it never stops as long as we're breathing, right? So we get to do that. We get to do that. Best game in town. Do that, bless yourself, and bless us all. Thank you. So if I said anything useful for you, beneficial, hold it in your mind while I speak the words of this affirmative prayer. I celebrate this opportunity to be alive. I celebrate this opportunity to be present here and now. I celebrate this opportunity to remember the infinite possibilities that show up as me and as each one. I know that each one walks through life in a beautiful meadow that contains their wildest dreams and imaginations. And each one already has that opportunity to choose, and choose again, and choose again, and choose again, and move into the life of their choosing. And even though this is kind of a chore sometimes, I recognize it is also a gift. The gift already given to each and every one of us. this thing called life is such a delight, such a joy, such a opportunity to explore and express and experience the goodness that surrounds each one at all times. And so I turn my eyes and my thought to this light, to this order, peace, joy, harmony, goodness. And I focus my attention there, and I remember that even when I forget and I make up stories to the contrary, I remember love is all there is, and I get to practice that. And so I take another breath, and I refocus my attention, and I return my gaze to that one that lives in, as, and through me, in, as, and through all, as this great goodness. I relax into this truth, and I let it be, and so it is.